Welcome to the deep dive. You send us your sources, and we dig into them, pull out the key insights so you can get informed fast.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at a really interesting conversation with Yanis Varoufakis. You'll likely know him, former Greek finance minister, economist, activist.
Right, quite a prominent voice. And this comes from a Middle East Eye interview prompted by, well, by your interest in understanding where the West stands today, global power shifts, that kind of thing.
And Varoufakis, well, he doesn't pull his punches, does he?
Mhm.
He's known for some pretty sharp critiques of Western society.
Definitely. So our mission really is to unpack his analysis. What he sees as this weakening, this decay maybe in the West. He talks about a mask it wears.
Yeah, and his views on Gaza, Ukraine,
Yeah.
the climate crisis, economic issues, figures
Right.
like Trump, it's all connected in his framework.
It is. Okay, let's get right into it. You know that famous Gandhi quote about Western civilization being a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
Varoufakis had this witty take on it, applying it to the EU, saying, a European Union would be a good idea, suggesting we don't even have a proper disunion yet. It kind of sets the tone, doesn't it?
It really does. It signals that critical perspective right away. So he agrees the West projects a certain image, right? But his goal, and ours today, is to look beneath that.
So he acknowledges achievements, arts, sciences, ideas about human rights.
Sure, things found in many civilizations, he'd point out. But because the West is dominant globally, he argues, we have to scrutinize its hypocrisies, its inconsistencies.
And its history. He doesn't shy away from that.
Not at all. He brings up a long history of what he calls Western genocides. First Nations in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, actions in Kenya, South Africa, Namibia.
He even links the funding of some Western institutions, maybe universities or museums, back to the slave trade and empire. He mentioned Brussels specifically, didn't he? And its connection to the Congo.
Exactly. And the crucial part is how he connects that past to right now. For him, today's problems aren't new. They're part of this longer pattern. The mask, as he calls it, is slipping.
Okay, so that's the historical backdrop. Let's shift to the economy. 2008 looms large for him.
Hugely.
Yep.
He sees it as a moment like 1929 where capitalism almost went extinct.
Mm.
I mean, think about that. The system nearly died.
And how did the 1929 crisis resolve, in his view?
Well, ultimately, World War II. And that war shifted global power hegemony decisively to the U.S.
But the U.S. maintained power differently after the 60s, right? Not through trade surpluses like older empires.
Precisely. It was through deficits. The U.S. bought more than it sold, ran these huge trade deficits. And countries like Germany, Japan, later China, they earned dollars selling things to the U.S.
And then what did they do with those dollars?
They sent them back. They financed the U.S. government, its military Wall Street. He calls the U.S. trade deficit a giant vacuum cleaner, sucking capital from around the world.
Stucking it back to New York, where it fueled financial innovation.
Well, yes, but specifically the creation of those complex, often toxic financial products that eventually blew up in 2008.
So if it almost collapsed, what stopped it? How did capitalism survive 2008?
Two main things, according to Varoufakis. First, China. Its massive increase in production and investment gave the global economy a huge boost.
Okay.
And central banks, especially the Fed and the European Central Bank,
Yeah.
they printed enormous amounts of money. He estimates around $35 trillion.
Wow. But that wasn't a real fix, was it?
No, because it went alongside austerity for ordinary people in the West. So you had this printed money propping up finance while the public faced cuts. He argues this mix created the conditions for things like, well, Trumpism.
And this leads to another big idea of his, that traditional capitalism actually died after 2008.
Yes. He argues we're now in something different, something he calls techno-feudalism.
Techno-feudalism. Okay, break that down. What's the techno part?
It's driven by what he calls cloud capital. Not clouds in the sky, obviously, but the infrastructure of the digital age.
Like fiber optic cables, our phones, the algorithms running things, AI.
Exactly. All that digital infrastructure, that's the new form of capital, he argues. And it concentrates power in the hands of big tech companies.
And why feudalism?
Because he sees these tech platforms, think Amazon Marketplace, Uber, Airbnb, as like digital fiefdoms. They aren't traditional markets. They're privately controlled spaces where the owners extract value, almost like feudal lords extracting rent.
And this new system, techno-feudalism, is it better or worse than capitalism?
Worse, in his view. He thinks it's less stable, produces more political fragmentation, and doesn't even replicate itself as effectively as capitalism did. It contributes to this feeling that the West is maybe finished.
But also more dangerous. You mentioned a wounded dragon analogy.
Yeah, the idea that something declining can lash out unpredictably. Power is shifting from old industries to these tech giants, giving them unprecedented control.
Okay, let's pivot to Trump then. Varoufakis warns against just focusing on his tariffs.
Right. He argues that's a surface-level view. He believes Trump, like Nixon before him, had or maybe has a team with a coherent economic strategy.
He draws parallels to Nixon's advisors, Kissinger, Volcker.
Exactly. And he points to people around Trump, like Scott Bessant or Stephen Mnuchin, suggesting they have a similar strategic mindset.
And what's the core of that strategy, according to Varoufakis?
It mirrors Nixon's 1971 shock,
Yeah.
fundamentally devaluing the U.S. dollar but keeping it dominant globally.
How would that even work? Devalue it, but keep it on top.
Well, the idea he outlines is orchestrate a significant devaluation, maybe 30%. This makes U.S. exports cheaper. But simultaneously, create conditions where foreigners holding dollars feel compelled to sell those cheaper dollars but buy U.S. dollar assets.
Like what kind of assets?
Long-term U.S. government debt, maybe even things like crypto assets denominated in dollars like Tether. So the dollar is cheaper for trade, but it's still where global wealth wants to be parked.
It sounds ambitious. Risky, even.
Oh, absolutely. And Varoufakis himself doubts it would actually work long-term. But his point is, don't dismiss the intention. He criticizes liberals for just calling Trump a buffoon, saying they made the same mistake with Nixon.
Underestimating the strategy behind the persona.
Precisely. And he contrasts this perceived American plan, however flawed, with Europe and the UK, which he describes pretty bluntly as being like decapitated chickens. No real plan at all.
Whereas others, like China maybe, are more aware of these shifts.
Yes, he suggests China, South Korea, others have a much better grasp of these deep economic games.
This brings us to what he calls the liberal blind spot. He connects this dismissal of Trump to how many liberals approach Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, it's a tough comparison he makes. He imagines the sheer outrage if, say, Trump released an AI video showing a Gaza occupation plan.
Okay.
And he contrasts that hypothetical outrage with what he sees as a more muted reaction to the very real ongoing military aid, billions of dollars flowing from the Biden administration to Israel.
And his explanation for that difference?
He's quite stark. A mixture of stupidity and nastiness. He lays primary responsibility for what he calls the genocide in Gaza squarely on the liberal establishment, Biden, Democrats, EU governments, because they finance and arm Israel.
What about the calls for a two-state solution?
He sees that as a smokescreen, basically. A way to sound good while still arming leaders like Netanyahu who actively oppose that very solution. It's hypocrisy, in his view.
So he finds Trump's potential approach almost more honest.
In its bluntness, yes. He suggests Trump's potential plans, however awful, might be less hypocritical than the centrist's position. He also argues Israeli policy towards Palestinians has had a brutal consistency since 1948, a pattern of disproportionate force.
And he's faced personal consequences for these views, right? Being banned from Germany?
Yes, even virtually. He sees that ban as a really worrying sign about the rule of law in Europe, maybe driven by a subconscious guilt or denial among leaders. Especially jarring, he notes, when you see EU buildings lit up in solidarity with Ukraine or Israel, but silence or censure on Palestine.
So the interviewer talks about the facade dropping. What are the consequences of that, as Varoufakis sees it?
Well, one major consequence is self-censorship. People becoming afraid to speak out, particularly on Palestine, which he calls the great moral clarifier of our time.
Meaning, how you respond to that issue reveals something fundamental.
Exactly. And he argues that turning a blind eye there weakens the ability to fight for other things, women's rights, workers' rights, whatever affects you locally. It erodes your moral compass, essentially.
He draws a parallel to 1938, doesn't he?
He does. To the persecution of Jews, then, suggesting that sort of moral blindness on one front can allow fascism, or at least authoritarianism, to gain ground more broadly.
But it's not all bleak. He sees pushback.
Definitely. He points to the huge protests, especially among younger generations who just see things differently. He also notes the objective shifts global GDP moving towards China and the global South, away from the old G7, and demographic shifts within Western countries, too.
And where does he find hope, then? If not in Europe or the U.S. establishment?
Primarily in the global South, but also, importantly, in the activists in the West, the young people and some older ones too, including, he emphasizes, Jewish comrades protesting for Palestine despite the risks.
But he sees a disconnect sometimes in those Western protests.
Yeah, he feels that sometimes Western protesters don't connect the fight for Palestine with their own liberation struggles, say economic justice or climate action,
Yeah.
in the way that, for instance, the anti-Vietnam War movement connected different struggles.
Whereas in the global south, that connection is clearer.
Much clearer, he thinks. Liberation movements there often see the Palestinian cause as intrinsically linked to their own histories and struggles.
Why the disconnect in the West, then? What's his explanation?
He points a finger directly at the center left. He argues they've betrayed core progressive values over decades.
He uses his own experience in Greece, right?
Yes, from 2015. The Greek people voted overwhelmingly against austerity in a referendum, giving the government a mandate to resist. But, in his account, the prime minister surrendered to the Troika, accepted austerity, and soon after signed a significant defense deal with Israel.
And the impact of that perceived betrayal.
Deep loss of hope, especially among the young, a feeling that the political system, even the supposedly progressive side, wouldn't fight for them.
Okay, let's talk about China and the global south more broadly. He makes a clear distinction between China and Russia.
Very clear. He sees Russia as basically an oligarchy that emerged from a messy post-Soviet transition with pretty negative social outcomes. China, he argues, is a different kind of experiment altogether.
Though he acknowledges the issues: lack of free speech, authoritarianism.
Absolutely. He doesn't brush those aside. But he also points to things he sees as positives, like surprisingly vibrant local democracy in some areas, efforts towards socialized housing, state regulation of big tech, unlike in the West, improvements in public schools, even a diversity of opinion beneath the surface.
And on the world stage.
He notes China hasn't really been an imperialist power in recent decades, hasn't started wars. Their foreign policy tends towards non-intervention, sometimes maybe too much so, he suggests.
And things like BRICS, the alternative financial systems being discussed.
He sees those as potentially very important. Efforts to build infrastructure outside of U.S. dollar control offer real opportunities for the global south to gain more autonomy.
Looking ahead then, say to 2035, it sounds like a pretty challenging picture he paints.
It is. He uses Ukraine as a kind of grim case study, showing the danger of being caught between powers, becoming, in his view, a U.S. colony while losing territory.
And techno-feudalism becomes even more central.
Yes. Cloud capital isn't just about economics. It's a tool for behavioral modification, he warns. It gives the owners of these platforms, Amazon, Google, etc., unprecedented power to shape how we think and act.
Replacing markets with these digital fiefdoms.
Right. And replacing profits with rents. This creates huge macroeconomic instability, he believes. And the fact that this cloud capital is concentrated mainly in the U.S. and China, that, for him, explains the new Cold War. It's a battle over control of this new dominant form of capital.
And climate change.
He doesn't even call it climate change anymore. It's climate disaster or catastrophe. He's deeply worried we've passed the point of no return.
And he blames both sides, Trump and the establishment.
Yes, he points out that Trump actively denies or downplays it, while the Biden administration, despite rhetoric, continues massive fossil fuel subsidies. Both, in his view, are accelerating the disaster.
With the impact falling hardest
The
on.
global south, disproportionately, while the powerful in the north will try to build walls, literal or metaphorical, to insulate themselves.
And cloud capital plays a role here, too.
Definitely. The algorithms on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they polarize discussions, spread disinformation, and make it harder for people to organize effectively against what he calls climate vandalism. It poisons the well.
It sounds incredibly bleak. Is there any way out?
Well, his message isn't one of easy optimism. It's more about understanding the forces at play, techno-feudalism, the political dynamics, the climate crisis, and the necessity to keep struggling, keep fighting, keep organizing, even if it feels too late.
Connecting the different struggles.
Yes, against cloud capital, against the Trumpists, against the failures of the liberal establishment, against what he calls the Israeli apartheid state, seeing them as interconnected facets of the current system.
So what are the alternatives he actually proposes? He mentions his book, Another Now.
Right. In that, and in his broader work, he outlines some core principles for a different future. It's not just critique. He does offer ideas.
What are the key ones?
Three main pillars, really. First, democratizing production. His model is basically one employee, one share, one vote within companies, ending that fundamental split between who owns the capital and who does the work.
Okay, democratizing the workplace. What else?
Second, collectivizing money. Moving away from monetary systems controlled by private banks and politicians serving them towards something he calls a monetary commons, money, as a public utility, essentially.
Interesting. And the third?
Public green investment on a massive scale. He argues the market simply cannot deliver the green transition needed. Wealth is created collectively, he says, so it needs collective direction, especially for huge challenges like climate change.
So democratize work, collectivize money, public investment for the planet.
That's the essence of the alternative vision he puts forward.
Well, this has been quite a journey through Yanis Varoufakis' thinking, a really challenging analysis.
It certainly is. We've covered his critique of the West, that idea of the mask slipping, the economic analysis moving from finance capital to techno-feudalism, his really pointed views on the liberal center, Gaza, Trump.
And the global power shifts, the role of China, the bleak climate outlook, but also those proposed alternatives.
A lot to take in, definitely.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Considering everything we've just discussed from Varoufakis' perspective, all these interconnected crises and analyses, what single action or maybe shift in focus do you think would make the most significant difference in tackling these challenges?
It's a tough question thinking about where leverage really lies.
It is something to reflect on the connections between these issues and where maybe individual or collective agency could have the biggest impact. Keep exploring these complex topics, keep seeking out different views. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.